London, a city I've walked through thousands of times, past buildings that hide stories most people never see. Right now, behind me, there's a former Victorian workhouse. From the street, it looks like any other old building, but inside these walls, something happened that terrified millions of people. Not a crime, not a war, a government policy. The Victorian workhouse was deliberately designed to be worse than anything else a poor person could experience. Worse than starvation, worse than prison. Families were ripped apart the moment they walked through the door. 1 in every 10 people who entered left in a coffin. 16 million people passed through this system in just over 100 years. I've been exploring the archives, reading letters from inmates who lived this nightmare. What I've found is shocking. This wasn't accidental cruelty. This was policy. I'm standing outside what was once the Cleveland Street Workhouse in London, built in 1778. From here you can see how close it was to respectable neighborhoods, how it loomed over the streets around it. Imagine walking toward those gates knowing what waited inside. You'd approach the entrance beneath an arch with words carved into the stone. Avoid idleness and intemperance. Before you even stepped through the door, the building was already judging you. There'd be a gateman in his little gatehouse, checking you in, making you wait. The bureaucracy was incredible. Sign in, state your business, prove you had nothing. No money, no job, no home. You had to satisfy the authorities that you were truly destitute before they'd let you in. The moment you were admitted, the humiliation began. Men, women, children. It didn't matter. You were taken to a bathroom and told to strip completely. Everything you wore, everything you owned was taken from you. Your clothes were bundled up and fumigated to kill lice. You were given a workhouse uniform, scratchy and identical to everyone else's. Brown dress and pinafore for women, rough shirts and trousers for men. Anything personal, anything that made you an individual was confiscated and locked away. Then came the bathing. Dozens of people used the same water. By the time you stepped into it, the water was already filthy from whoever came before you. Can you imagine that? The shock of it? 1 week you're a person with a name, a family, a life. The next week you're standing naked in someone else's dirty bathwater wearing institutional clothes. But the worst part, the part that made the workhouse more feared than almost anything else, was what happened next. Separation. The moment you walked through those gates, your family was taken from you. Husbands were led one way, wives another. Children over the age of 7 were separated from their parents entirely. If you were an elderly couple who'd spent 50 years together, it didn't matter. You went to the female ward, your husband went to the male ward, and you were forbidden from seeing each other except for 1 hour a week under supervision. The architecture itself was designed to enforce this. I've got a map here from the 1870s showing how the workhouse was laid out. You can see it clearly. Male side, female side, with a central corridor running between them, but it goes further than that. Within each side there's another division, good and bad. The Victorians actually categorized people this way. Are you a deserving pauper or an undeserving one? Are you here because of genuine misfortune or because you're idle and immoral? The building physically separated people based on these judgments. The women lived up there in those top windows. From there they could see out onto the street, watch normal life happening just meters away. Charles Dickens lived just a few doors down from this workhouse when he was a boy. He watched people going in and out. He saw the women in the windows. Years later, he wrote about it, thinly disguised, in Oliver Twist. Why did they do this? Why separate families so brutally? The authorities believed poverty was contagious, that it spread through moral weakness. If you kept husbands away from wives, parents away from children, you could contain it. You stop the toxic influence of pauperism from spreading to the next generation. Break up the family unit and you break the cycle of poverty. That was the theory. It was also about punishment. The Victorians believed that if you'd ended up in the workhouse, you'd failed. You'd failed to provide for yourself, failed to stand on your own 2 feet. The separation wasn't just practical, it was designed to shame you, to make you feel so terrible about being there that you'd do absolutely anything to avoid coming back. What's striking when you read the historical records is how regimented everything was. The gatemen kept meticulous logs. Everyone who came in, everyone who went out, the dates, the reasons. I've seen these registers, columns and columns of names. Elizabeth Longstaff admitted, discharged, admitted again. James Lambert admitted. Yeah, date of discharge, dead. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't accidental. Every single aspect of the workhouse admission process was carefully designed. The stripping, the bathing, the uniforms, the confiscation of belongings, the architectural separation of families. It was all deliberate. The Victorians engineered an institution that would terrify people so much that only the truly desperate would enter. And even then, they made sure you'd remember every moment of humiliation. Your punishment for the crime of being poor. Once you were inside the workhouse, stripped of your possessions and separated from your family, the real ordeal began. Food and work. Two things that defined every single day of your existence here. Let me show you a document from 1830, an actual diet plan from a London workhouse. Sunday breakfast, gruel. That's porridge made with water, no milk, no sugar, nothing to make it palatable. For dinner, you'd get some bread, a bit of boiled ox beef with greens or potatoes, and a quart of table beer. That sounds almost reasonable until you realize the portions were tiny, and this was the best meal of the week. Monday, gruel for breakfast, bread, and cheese for dinner. Tuesday, gruel again, bread, and boiled bacon. Wednesday, gruel, bread, and beef. It goes on like this, day after day, week after week, month after month. The gruel was watery, thin, barely enough to keep you alive, dry bread, cold water, portions deliberately calculated to be worse than what a low-paid factory worker could afford outside. This was the principle of less eligibility. Life inside the workhouse had to be worse than the worst life outside. Otherwise, people would use it as an easy option instead of working. Some inmates openly stated they preferred prison. In prison, the food was better. In prison, you got more. There are records of paupers deliberately committing crimes just to be sent to jail instead of the workhouse. Think about that. People choosing prison over this place. Oliver Twist asking for more wasn't Charles Dickens exaggerating for dramatic effect. It was reality. Children were genuinely that hungry. Adults were genuinely that hungry. And asking for more was seen as outrageous entitlement, evidence of moral failing. You're poor, you're being given shelter and food at public expense, and you dare to ask for more? The audacity of it. But the food was only half the punishment. Work was the other half. 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, you worked. Not productive work, not work that taught you a skill or built something useful, deliberately pointless, mind-destroying labor designed to break your spirit. Stone breaking, you sat in a yard with a hammer and a pile of rocks, smashing them into smaller pieces for hours on end. Bang, bang, bang. Your hands blistered, then bled, then calloused over. The noise, the dust, the monotony. And for what? The broken stones weren't used for anything meaningful. It was just labor for labor's sake, or oakum picking. This was worse. You were given old tarred rope from ships, and you had to unpick it fiber by fiber with your bare hands, unraveling rope that had been soaked in tar, pulling it apart strand by strand until you met your daily quota. The tar got under your fingernails, into the cuts on your hands, stained your skin black. Your fingers bled. See, the fibers cut into your flesh. Hour after hour, day after day, pulling apart old rope. Some workhouses had bone crushing. Bones from butchers were brought in, and inmates had to grind them down into powder for fertilizer. The smell was appalling. Rotting meat still clinging to the bones, the stench filling the workhouse, the dust from grinding getting into your lungs. Women did different work, but equally soul-destroying. Laundry. Endless washing in huge vats of boiling water, scrubbing institutional linens, sheets, and uniforms for hundreds of people. The steam, the heat, the caustic soap burning their hands. Or they picked oakum, too, sitting in silent rows, unpicking rope until their fingers were raw. This wasn't about rehabilitation. It wasn't about teaching people skills they could use to find employment outside. It was punishment. It was meant to be so unbearable that you'd do anything, take any job, no matter how badly paid, endure any hardship, rather than come back here. The whole system was built on a test, the workhouse test. If you're willing to be stripped naked, bathed in filthy water, separated from your family, fed on gruel, and work 10 hours a day breaking rocks or picking oakum, then you must genuinely be desperate. You must truly have no other option, and only then do you deserve help. It was incredibly expensive to run. Building these huge institutions, staffing them, feeding hundreds of people even on starvation rations, it cost a fortune. The old system of outdoor relief, just giving poor people a bit of money or food to help them through hard times, that was much cheaper. But the Victorians didn't want cheap. They wanted deterrence. They wanted something so terrible that it would frighten people into finding any alternative. And it worked. Millions of people lived in desperate poverty rather than enter these gates. They starved in the streets, slept rough, watched their children go hungry, anything rather than subject themselves to this. I'm at the National Archives now, and what I'm looking at is extraordinary. Thousands of letters written by workhouse inmates preserved in these massive volumes. Each book covers just a couple of years from a single workhouse, and there are hundreds of these books, thousands upon thousands of voices speaking directly to us across time. The thing that strikes me immediately is how well written many of these letters are. These aren't illiterate people scrawling desperate pleas. These are articulate, intelligent individuals who understand the law, who know their rights, who can argue their case with precision and force. Here's one from a man called James Longstaff, writing on behalf of his daughter who's in the workhouse. She's just given birth to an illegitimate child, and he's furious about how she's being treated. Listen to how he phrases this. Sir, will you have the goodness to inform a most anxious and heartbroken father if under any possible circumstance the master of a union workhouse is justified in keeping a pauper, and that pauper only just discharged from a hospital without a morsel of bread 7 whole days, that is 5 days successively and 2 days after? Look at the rhetoric he's using. Is it justified? Does the law allow this? He's not begging, he's challenging. He's putting the authorities on the spot, demanding they answer whether their own rules permit this treatment. Every word is chosen carefully. This is a man who knows that words have power. And it worked. His letter triggered an official investigation into conditions at that workhouse. Here's another one, from a woman named Eliza Longstaff. Same workhouse, different complaint. She writes about the treatment of inmates and specifically asks for an inspector to visit. But then she adds this. Please to allow a reporter to attend as they don't like the truth to be exposed. A reporter. She's asking for a journalist. She understands that publicity is a weapon, that the workhouse masters feared nothing more than having their behavior reported in the newspapers. The poor weren't stupid. They knew exactly how to exploit the system's contradictions. This is what's so remarkable about these archives. For so long we've thought of workhouse inmates as passive victims, helpless people ground down by poverty and institutional cruelty. But these letters show something completely different. These are people fighting back, using every tool they have. Here's one from a man called Archibald Young. He's elderly, living in the male ward, and he's written to complain about something very specific. The toilet outside his block has been locked by the master. No explanation, just locked. Now elderly men have to walk the entire length of the workhouse to use facilities elsewhere. He explains the consequences very clearly. Now this has already been the death of one man of the name of O'Brien, who was found dead in his bed after he had returned from the water closet down the yard. A man died because he was too frail to make that journey. And Archibald Young is reporting it, demanding action. He's not just complaining about inconvenience. He's documenting what amounts to negligence causing death. The response from the authorities is interesting too. The master claims the toilets were dirty, so he locked them. The commissioners order him to clean the toilets and unlock them. Problem solved. But only because Archibald Young had the literacy, the courage, and the knowledge of how the system worked to write that letter. What these archives reveal is an ongoing battle. Masters and matrons running workhouses as their own little kingdoms, abusing their power, cutting corners, punishing inmates for any perceived slight. And inmates who refused to accept it, who wrote letters, who demanded inspections, who knew the rules better than the people supposedly enforcing them. Physical punishment wasn't officially allowed, but it happened constantly. Reduced food rations, being locked in punishment cells, beatings that were explained away as accidents. The gap between the official regulations and what actually happened inside these walls was enormous. One woman wrote that she couldn't mention a quarter of the brutality that occurred. A quarter. Imagine what she witnessed that she felt she could only hint at, couldn't bring herself to describe in detail. But here's what really gets me about these letters. They were never meant to survive. They were bureaucratic documents filed away in government offices, meant to gather dust and be forgotten. Nobody thought that 200 years later someone would be reading them, hearing these voices again. These people deserve to be heard, not as statistics, not as nameless poor, but as individuals with names and personalities and the intelligence to fight for themselves. They used words as weapons because words were all they had. They wrote to commissioners, demanded investigations, asked for reporters, quoted the law back at the people who were supposed to uphold it. The workhouse tried to strip them of dignity, of individuality, of voice, but they refused to be silenced. And now, in these dusty volumes, they're still speaking, still demanding to be heard, still insisting that what happened to them mattered. The separation of families wasn't just cruel to adults. For children, the workhouse was a special kind of nightmare. Any child over the age of 7 was taken from their parents the moment they entered. Younger children stayed with their mothers in the female ward, but the instant you turned 7, that was it. You were moved to the children's block and your parents became strangers you saw for 1 supervised hour per week. I'm looking at records from Hanwell Industrial School, one of the pauper schools where workhouse children were sent. Over 800 children lived here at its peak. They slept in huge dormitories, dozens of beds lined up in rows. They were taught basic literacy and numeracy, but also trades, carpentry, metalwork, tailoring for boys, domestic service skills for girls. The idea was to train them for future employment, break the cycle of poverty by giving them skills their parents didn't have, but it was also a place of harsh discipline. Every Thursday, the names of children who'd misbehaved that week were read out in the playground. On Friday, they were punished. The boys were brought into the gymnasium, which doubled as the punishment room. They were bent over a desk and beaten with a cane, 3 strokes, 6 strokes, sometimes more depending on the offense. Girls weren't beaten, but they faced other punishments. Reduced food rations, being locked in windowless cells for up to 24 hours, hard labor scrubbing floors. The punishment wasn't always deserved. Children were accused of things they didn't do, punished as examples to others, brutalized for minor infractions. It was about control, about breaking their spirit, about teaching them their place in society. But here's the thing about taking children away from their parents and raising them in institutions. You could do whatever you wanted with them, and what the authorities wanted was to get rid of them entirely. 7,000 children were born in workhouses every year, illegitimate births, mothers who had nowhere else to go. These children had the stigma of the workhouse stamped on them from birth. Their birth certificates listed their place of birth as the workhouse. For the rest of their lives, anyone who saw that certificate would know. You're a workhouse child, bottom of the social ladder. The system could also remove children from parents deemed unfit. If your mother had multiple illegitimate children, if your father was frequently drunk, if your family kept coming back to the workhouse, the Board of Guardians could simply take you, adopt you into the care of the state. Your parents lost all rights. You became property of the institution, and once the workhouse had you, it could send you anywhere. From the late 1860s onwards, a scheme began that would eventually affect 150,000 children. Child migration. The authorities partnered with charitable organizations like Dr. Barnardo's, the church, various emigration societies. Together they shipped workhouse children to the colonies, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, thousands of miles away from everything they knew. The children were told they were going to a better life. In some cases, that was true. Some ended up with decent foster families, got education, opportunities they'd never have had in Britain. But many others were used as cheap labor on farms, in factories, treated appallingly, cut off from any possibility of ever seeing their families again. Siblings were separated and sent to different colonies. Brothers and sisters who'd clung to each other through the workhouse experience were pulled apart at the docks, put on different ships, sent to opposite sides of the world. They never saw each other again. The last child migration ship left Britain in 1967. 1967. This isn't ancient history. There are people alive today who went through this, who were taken from their families and shipped to Australia as children. In 2010, Prime Minister Gordon Brown formally apologized for the child migration scheme, an official acknowledgement that what happened was wrong, that the cruelty was inexcusable. But for the families torn apart, for the siblings who spent their entire lives searching for each other, that apology came far too late. Back in the workhouse itself, children who remained in Britain faced their own struggles. The education was basic. The discipline was brutal. The food was the same starvation diet as the adults. And hanging over everything was the knowledge that you were marked for life. Even if you escaped, even if you found work and built a life outside, people knew. The workhouse followed you. Employers didn't want to hire workhouse children. Respectable families didn't want their sons or daughters marrying someone with that background. The stigma was so powerful that many people hid their workhouse childhood from their own children, took the secret to their graves. What strikes me most about the treatment of children in the workhouse is how it was justified. Breaking up families, shipping children to the other side of the world, brutal punishment, stigmatizing them from birth. All of this was done in the name of helping them, saving them from the cycle of poverty, giving them a fresh start. But you can't save someone by destroying their family. You can't help a child by branding them as unworthy from the day they're born. 1 in every 10 people who entered the workhouse left only in a coffin. Think about that statistic for a moment. 10% mortality. These weren't just the very elderly or the terminally ill. These were people who came in sick, malnourished, desperate, and the workhouse finished them off. I'm looking at a death certificate now from 1881. Jesse Carter, age 23, died in a London teaching hospital after being transferred from a Kent workhouse. Cause of death? Angina, a heart condition. He'd been suffering for months in terrible pain, moved from the workhouse to the hospital as his condition worsened, and then he died, far from his family, in a dissection theater. What happened next is what terrified the poor more than almost anything else. Jesse's body didn't go home. His family couldn't afford to pay for the burial, couldn't afford to transport his body back to Kent. So under the Anatomy Act of 1832, Jesse's body was sent for medical dissection. The Anatomy Act was a piece of legislation that sounds reasonable on paper. Medical schools needed bodies to train doctors and surgeons. Before 1832, the only legal source was executed criminals. But there weren't enough executions to supply the demand. So body snatchers dug up fresh graves and sold corpses to medical schools. The Anatomy Act was meant to stop that by providing a legal supply of bodies. And where did those bodies come from? The workhouse. If you died in the workhouse and nobody claimed your body within a set period, you were sent to a medical school for dissection. Your welfare debt to society, as they called it. The state had fed you, housed you, cared for you in your final illness. In exchange, you repaid that debt by giving your body to medical science. For the crime of poverty, you would be dissected. That's how it was seen, a punishment that extended beyond death. Let me show you what dissection actually meant. I've got photographs here from the late Victorian period, from medical schools in Cambridge and London. These are images of dissection rooms. Bodies laid out on tables, medical students standing around them. But these aren't gentle, respectful examinations. The bodies are cut apart extensively, limbs removed, torsos opened, organs extracted, skulls sawed through to access the brain. This was the nightmare that haunted poor people. Not just dying poor, but having your body cut to pieces afterwards. No proper burial, no grave your family could visit, no peace even in death. The religious implications were enormous too. Many Victorians believed in physical resurrection. On Judgment Day, your body would rise from the grave. But what if your body had been dissected, scattered across a medical school, parts of you discarded as waste? What happened to your soul then? The terror of dissection wasn't just about dignity, it was about your eternal afterlife. The families bankrupted themselves trying to avoid this fate. They'd scrape together money they didn't have, borrow from neighbors, sell whatever they owned, just to pay for a burial and prevent dissection. Because the stigma wasn't just on the dead person, it fell on the whole family. If your father was dissected, people knew your family was so poor, so worthless, they couldn't even bury him. Behind the workhouse, there was usually a cemetery for inmates who died. Archaeological excavations at former workhouses have revealed hundreds of burials stacked on top of each other. 7, 8, sometimes more bodies in a single grave shaft. Coffins piled vertically to save space and cost. Some skeletons show evidence of having slumped over time as the coffins rotted, corpses ending up almost sitting upright, skeletal faces pressed against the skull of whoever was buried below them. Many of these skeletons also show clear evidence of dissection. Skulls with neat circular cuts where the top was removed to examine the brain, rib cages cut through, sternums removed, limbs showing saw marks where they were detached from the body. Even after dissection, even after being cut apart for medical students to practice on, the remains were eventually buried in the workhouse cemetery. But by then you'd been through the ultimate humiliation. The workhouse infirmary was actually one of the few places poor people could get medical care. If you were sick and had no money, the workhouse would take you in, treat you, house you while you recovered. This was the foundation of what would eventually become the National Health Service, or free health care for everyone regardless of ability to pay. But the cost of that care was steep. Overcrowded wards, inadequate nursing, doctors who were overworked and underpaid, and if you died, if the treatment failed, your body became property of the state. There's a physician's report from the 1850s describing conditions in a London workhouse infirmary. He wrote about scores of preventable deaths, mothers and children dying of illnesses that could have been treated with proper care, nurses who were often drunk, elderly pauper inmates doing the nursing because the workhouse wouldn't pay for professionals. It was unsuitable for the reception of any human being, however degraded. Your punishment for being poor didn't end when you died. It followed you beyond the grave. The workhouse system wasn't an accident. It wasn't something that evolved organically over time. It was deliberately designed by intelligent, educated people who sat in rooms and calculated exactly how much suffering was necessary to deter the poor from seeking help. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act created the system as we know it. Before that, parishes had their own ways of dealing with poverty. Outdoor relief, they called it. Giving people a bit of money, some bread, helping them pay rent. It was cheaper, more humane, and it kept families together. But the authorities decided it was too generous, that it encouraged idleness. The architect of the new system was a man named Edwin Chadwick. A lawyer, a social reformer, genuinely believed he was solving the problem of poverty. He looked at the rising costs of poor relief and concluded that the old system was creating dependency. And so people were relying on handouts instead of working. The solution, he decided, was to make relief so unpleasant that only the genuinely desperate would accept it. This was the principle of less eligibility. The idea was simple. Life inside the workhouse had to be less eligible, less desirable than the worst life outside. If you made conditions terrible enough, people would do anything to avoid entering. They'd take the lowest paid jobs, endure the worst working conditions, live in abject poverty rather than subject themselves to the workhouse. It was meant to be a deterrent, not actual relief. The cruelty was the point. Chadwick and the poor law commissioners drew up detailed regulations. How much food inmates should receive, calculated to the ounce to be worse than what a laborer could afford. How many hours of work? What type of labor would be most unpleasant while producing minimal value? The separation of families, the stripping of possessions, the uniforms, all of it was policy. Written down, debated, approved by Parliament. The Victorians were obsessed with the idea of the deserving versus the undeserving poor. If you were old, sick, disabled through no fault of your own, you were deserving. You'd worked hard all your life, and circumstances beyond your control had brought you low. But if you were able-bodied and unemployed, you were undeserving. Idle, morally weak, probably drunk. Why should hard-working taxpayers support you? The workhouse was designed to sort between these categories. The test was simple. If you're willing to endure separation from your family, starvation diet, pointless labor, and complete loss of dignity, then you must truly need help. If you're not willing, well, clearly you're not desperate enough. Go find work. What's extraordinary is how expensive this system was. Building hundreds of massive institutions across the country, staffing them with masters and matrons and guards and nurses, feeding and housing potentially thousands of people per workhouse. The old outdoor relief cost a fraction of this. You could help far more people for far less money by just giving them assistance where they lived. But that wasn't the point. The point was deterrence. The point was creating something so terrifying that it would frighten people away from seeking help at all. And if it cost more, well, that was acceptable because it would reduce dependency in the long run. Or so the theory went. The reality was that it created a self-perpetuating bureaucracy. Workhouses became institutions with their own interests, masters who ran them like personal fiefdoms, guardians who justified their positions by categorizing the poor into ever more specific classifications. Elderly deserving, elderly undeserving, able-bodied male, able-bodied female, children, infirm, lunatic, imbecile. Each category with its own ward, its own rules, its own treatment. Opposition to the system came from various quarters. Charles Dickens wrote Oliver Twist as a direct attack on the workhouse, published just 4 years after the Poor Law Amendment Act. His portrayal of brutal beadles and starving children was an exaggeration. If anything, he softened it for public consumption. Medical reformers like Dr. Joseph Rogers, who worked as a physician in the Strand Union Workhouse, documented the appalling conditions and fought for decades to improve health care for inmates. He wrote reports about preventable deaths, about drunk nurses, about sick people left without proper care. He got influential people interested, including Dickens himself. Social investigators went into workhouses and came out horrified. They published accounts in newspapers, triggered official inquiries. Slowly, gradually, reforms were implemented. Professional nursing, separate infirmaries, better food, less brutal discipline. But the fundamental principle never changed. The workhouse remained a deterrent. It remained a place people feared, because that's what it was designed to be. What strikes me most about studying this system is the cold calculation behind it. These weren't monsters designing the workhouse. They were respectable Victorian gentlemen who genuinely believed they were solving a social problem. They thought that if you made poverty painful enough, people would simply stop being poor. They never questioned whether there were enough jobs, whether wages were sufficient to live on, whether economic forces beyond any individual's control might cause poverty regardless of moral character. They just assumed that poverty was a choice, and if you made the consequences terrible enough, people would choose differently. That assumption was wrong, and millions suffered for it. Here's something that surprises people about the workhouse. The door was always open. You could leave whenever you wanted. You weren't a prisoner, you were a pauper, and the law was very clear about the distinction. If you wanted to walk out, you could. Sign out at the gatehouse, collect your fumigated clothes, and go. So why didn't people just leave? Where would they go? That's the question. If you had somewhere to go, if you had family who'd take you in, a job waiting, a room you could afford, you'd never have come to the workhouse in the first place. The door might have been open, but for most people there was nothing on the other side except the same desperate circumstances that had brought them there. What you see in the records is a pattern. People coming in, staying a few days or weeks, leaving, then coming back. In and out, cycling through the system as their circumstances changed. A laborer gets sick, can't work, comes to the workhouse, recovers, gets discharged, finds a few days of employment, falls sick again, comes back. A woman's husband dies, she has no income, enters the workhouse with her children, finds work as a domestic servant, leaves, gets dismissed, returns. The gatehouse registers show this clearly. The same names appearing over and over. Patrick McCann, a Scottish laborer, appears dozens of times. Admitted with bronchitis, discharged after 4 days. Readmitted 2 months later. Discharged again. Back in 3 weeks. For 14 years, he went through this cycle until finally he was declared insane and sent to an asylum. The system didn't help him, it just patched him up enough to throw him back out. But some people did escape permanently. Marriage was one route out, especially for women. If you could find someone willing to marry you despite the stigma of the workhouse, you could leave and hopefully never return. The records show women being discharged on a Saturday morning to be married that same afternoon. Straight from the workhouse to the church, changing from institutional uniform to wedding dress. For young men, the military offered an escape. The workhouse produced exactly the type of recruits the Army wanted: fit, disciplined, with no family ties to hold them back. Thousands of workhouse boys enlisted. During the First World War, they volunteered in enormous numbers. Some saw it as patriotic duty, but many also saw it as a chance to prove themselves, to earn respect, to escape the stigma of their upbringing. Employment was harder. The workhouse branded you. Potential employers knew that if you'd been in the workhouse, you were the lowest of the low. Why hire you when there were others without that stain on their character? Some people lied. They claimed they'd been somewhere else. Others moved to different cities where nobody knew their history. The stigma was so powerful that families hid it for generations. I've spoken to people whose grandparents were in workhouses and never told anyone. They took the secret to their graves. Their children only found out decades later when researching family history, finding names in workhouse registers, birth certificates listing the workhouse as place of birth. The shame outlasted the institution itself. By the early 20th century, attitudes were beginning to shift. The workhouse was looking increasingly outdated. Other countries had different systems. Germany had social insurance. The idea that the state had a responsibility to help the vulnerable, not just punish them for being poor, was gaining ground. In 1929, the workhouse was formally abolished by Act of Parliament, but abolishing it on paper and actually closing the buildings were two different things. The structures remained, the inmates remained, they just changed the names. Poor law institutions became public assistance institutions. The function continued even as the terminology softened. It took another 2 decades to phase them out completely. During the Second World War, some workhouse buildings were converted to emergency hospitals. After the war, when the National Health Service was created in 1948, the last workhouses were absorbed into the new system. The final one closed its doors as a workhouse and reopened as an NHS hospital. 16 million people had passed through the workhouse system in just over 100 years. 1 in every 10 people in Britain today has a direct family connection to this institution through a parent, grandparent, or great-grandparent. The scale of it is staggering. What's left now? Most of the buildings have been demolished or converted. Luxury apartments, office blocks, shopping centers built on the sites where hundreds of thousands suffered. A few have been preserved as museums, their histories carefully documented. Archaeological excavations occasionally uncover workhouse cemeteries, hundreds of skeletons stacked in unmarked graves. But perhaps the most important legacy is in the National Archives, in local record offices, in those thousands of letters written by inmates, voices that refused to be silenced, people who fought back with the only weapon they had: words. They wrote to demand their rights, to expose brutality, to protest injustice. They asked for journalists to witness conditions. They quoted the law back at the authorities. They refused to accept that poverty meant they deserved no dignity. The workhouse tried to erase them. History almost forgot them. But they're still there, still speaking, still insisting that what happened mattered. I'm back where I started, standing outside the former Cleveland Street workhouse. It looks so ordinary now, doesn't it? Just another old building in central London. But knowing what happened here changes how you see it. 16 million people passed through workhouses like this one. Families torn apart, children shipped to the other side of the world. People worked to exhaustion on starvation rations. Bodies dissected after death because their families were too poor to bury them. All of it deliberate policy. No, carefully designed by intelligent people who genuinely believed this was the solution to poverty. The last workhouse closed in 1948. That's not ancient history. There are people alive today who remember them, who lived in them as children, who carry those scars. But here's the uncomfortable question. Have we really moved on? Walk through any British city today and you'll see homeless people sleeping in doorways, food banks handing out emergency parcels to families who can't afford to eat, hostile architecture designed to make rough sleeping impossible, political rhetoric about scroungers and benefit cheats, the deserving versus the undeserving poor. The workhouse is gone, but the attitudes that created it haven't entirely disappeared. The idea that poverty is a moral failing, that if you just tried harder you wouldn't need help, that we need to make support unpleasant enough to deter people from seeking it. The Victorians looked at poverty and built the workhouse. We look back at them with horror. But how will history judge us? What will people 150 years from now think about how we treat the most vulnerable in our society? 1 in every 10 British people has a family connection to the workhouse. Those 16 million people, those voices in the archives, they deserve to be remembered. Not as statistics, not as shameful secrets, but as human beings who suffered under a system that valued deterrence over compassion. They fought back. They refused to be silenced. And their story matters.